I'm louder than the gavel, Lord. And it was firm.
It was rather firm.
Come on, Lisa.
All right, we're gonna bring the meeting to order. Welcome to our first meeting of 2023.
Happy New Year, everybody.
Happy New Year. Happy New Year. Happy New Year. All right. We'll get to do the roll call, please.
Okay, Ms. Banks,
I'm here.
Mr. Arnold,
Here.
Ms. Bell,
Here.
Mr. Brown,
Here.
Ms. Carter, Ms. Friedman,
Here.
Mr. Janai, Reverend Gordon,
Here.
Ms. Harding, here, Ms. Mendoza-Locke, Mr. Knowles,
Here.
Mr. O'Connor,
Here.
Ms. Rodriguez,
Here.
Dr. Russell,
Here.
Mr. Stengel, Major White.
Here. All right, recognition of visitors.
Mr. Arnold. Michael Carter, board staff.
Stacy Lawson, Unison.
Tara Dove, Transfer Mental Health.
Paul Rose Recovery Council and St. Paul Community Center Board of Trustees.
Tina Mason, board staff. Latrice Flowers, board staff.
Hey. All right. Thank you. Welcome all of us here today.
Yep.
All right, do I have a motion to approve the minutes from December 6th?
So moved.
Second. Are there any questions? All right, all those in favor?
Aye.
Those against? Those abstaining? All right, motion passes. All right, number 5, Jenny.
The financial statements for November start on page 5 of the packet. November was a pretty quiet month as far as our financials went. We had our bi-monthly grant payments, but as you can see for revenue, we only had $579,000 of revenue come in November. In our budget variances, our local levy revenue, as I mentioned last month, we have a variance of $215,000, which is where I expect us to be through probably about March when we get our second half allocation for the year. In the federal revenue, the variance there is mostly due to underspending of the SOAR 2.0 Year 2 grant that I mentioned the last couple months. And then in the state revenue, this is mostly due to 2 different grants, the multi-system adult grant and the addiction treatment program grant. Both of those, we do expect additional expenses. We're seeing some additional expenses now, but we do expect both of them to be underspent by the end of at the end of the year. And then in the expenses, we were underspent again in all the categories, pretty consistent with where we have been the last several months on that. And because it was a bi-monthly grant payment month, we had quite a few more expenses than revenue. So we had a decrease in net assets of $2.8 million. Then I'm going to flip to the balance sheet on page 6. And as I said before, the main decrease there in cash was our bi-monthly grant payments. Then you will notice if you jump all the way down to the bottom under the fund balances, so we still have our capital projects board designated, so that would be the St. Paul's Task Warren Commons, the Crisis Capital, and the Adult Psych Rehab funds that we have set aside. We also then, in November, have the $1.2 million that we set aside for the Infrastructure Transformation Project, the ITP project. So our total designated funds are $4.3 million. And then our non-designated fund balance at the end of November is $17.48 million. And there are payments on pages 7 and 8 and a motion on page 4.
So moved.
Second. Any questions? All those in favor? Aye. Those against? Those abstaining? All right, motion passes. Next one, Jenny?
This is at the top of page 9, the Lucas County Guardianship Services Board allocation. So you may remember back in May of 2022, we had an allocation to Lucas County Guardianship Services Board for our fiscal year 23. So it went from July through June of 23. The Lucas County Guardianship Services Board actually runs on a calendar year, so their contract actually ended December 31st. In order to renew the contract for another year, we have the funds available for the first 6 months of the next contract, but not the second 6 months. So this motion is the additional funds for the second 6 months of the calendar year, and then the ability to enter into that contract with the Guardianship Services Board. So we already have $137,500 approved in our purchasing plan for the period of January through June of 2023. This would be an additional $137,500 for a total of $275 for the calendar year for 2023. And there's a motion at the top of page 9.
So that's to approve the second half, 2020?
Yes.
Okay.
Are we gonna have to do this every year?
Yeah, because unfortunately, it's just, they run on the calendar year and we run on the fiscal year, so there's not really, unless we purposely plan,
Like an 18-month allocation?
yes,
Then that would have to be outside of the purchasing plan.
correct.
Okay.
So moved.
Second.
Okay. Any other questions? All right, all those in favor?
Aye.
Those against? Those abstaining? All right, the motion passes. Let's see, Jenny?
This is late submission of fiscal year 22 audit reports on the middle of page 9. So you might recall that per our agency agreement, our agencies have 5 months from the end of their fiscal year to submit their certified audit to us. We have, most of our agencies are on the same calendar, the same fiscal year that we are. So most of their year end was June 30th. And therefore, their audit was due to us on December 1st. As of December 1st, we had 8 agencies who had not submitted their audit to us by then. Consistent with our agency agreement, Scott sent a letter on December 6th when he returned from vacation, giving them written notice of intent to withhold funds, and they had 14 days to submit the audit. Since that time, we have had 4 of them submit the audit. There's actually an amendment to the motion, which I will get to in a second, and there are 4 of them still outstanding. I had conversations via email or over the phone with all of the agencies. I, at this point in time, do not have any concerns that there is anything fiscally holding up the audits, but I don't know because we don't have them yet. I haven't had any conversations with any auditors. We are just in a waiting game at this point. Most of the reasons for the delays, a lot of the agencies said the auditors couldn't get them in or the auditors were short-staffed. I think we all kind of have been feeling that. I don't know the validity of that or not, but that is what I was told from most of them. The motion on page 9 is to withhold payment of funds effective immediately for the agencies that we have not received the audit from. So the change to that would be Center of Hope Family Services, because we received their audit late last week after the packet was written. So the motion should say the Mental Health and Recovery Services Board of Lucas County authorizes its executive director to withhold payment of funds effective immediately for Big Brothers Big Sisters of Northwestern Ohio, Family and Child Abuse Prevention Center, Harbor, and Ohio Guidestone, until which time the agency submits to the board its annual independent audit for June 30th, 2022. And I can answer any questions anyone has.
Are there any ramifications to the board that impact the board as relates to lateness in following these audits? receiving or following these audits?
So I have to do, I mean, I obviously review all of the audits as they come in, and I have to do my own separate reports on them. I submit reports to Ohio Moss. We use the audits internally a lot in our discussions. So, I mean, though a day isn't, you know, going to make us miss any certain deadlines, certainly we use the audits, and it does hold us
Well,
up.
I asked a question, maybe I'm wrong, or maybe my memory is fading in my age, but I see frequent flyers on here. So the same excuse every year, I mean, so, yeah, that's troublesome to me. But anyway.
No withholding of payment, they would be, anything they submit in the meantime would eventually be paid if they.
Yes, yes, yep, they get paid when the audit is submitted, yes.
And I think, just to assure transparency, the final decision on withholding payments is in January of 17th, January 17th, correct? Well, we paid them January and February's grant payments.
Well, we will as soon as the auditor's office
Right.
opens this week.
Right. So they will get their January, February payments. And so it will really impact March moving forward.
Okay.
Unless you're a POS agency, and then anything
Then it would
after
be- Right.
payment is held.
Yeah.
And those are mainly most of the larger agencies.
Which really automatically sort of gives them an extra 60 days
Yeah.
leeway, and they know that, which plays into, well, I shouldn't say plays into, might impact
Yeah.
how they push the auditors.
Yeah.
And-
But, excuse me, but nobody wants to be on this list. Nobody wants us sitting here in this public forum talking about them not submitting an
Right,
audit.
right,
So, you know,
Well, looking back, and again, I'm not, again, my memories falls fuzzy, but looking back, I'm just trying to not make sure we don't get in a situation like we had at one point where we went through the late audit process or whatever it may be, and then okay, we'll let them see what happens, and then some improprieties may pop up after the fact. How does that play into it?
Agreed. I mean, that's really where we are.
Yeah.
I didn't see anything in any of my conversations that made me say, oh, but that is exactly where we are. Yes.
So if there are negative findings during their audit, then how does that impact the funding that we are given? I mean,
that is largely your decision, because this vote would say withhold the funding, right? And so, as Jenny indicated, we don't have any flags that suggest there's anything going on that, you know, other than what they've stated. Unlike last year, there were plenty of flags. And if you recall, this process brought those issues to light. So we take this very seriously. I will just simply also remind you that this is contractual language that we're using. So your decision is withhold the funds or not withhold the funds. There isn't an in-between because we're talking about contractual. To your question, yes, we do and may have some exposure for January and February if there are some improprieties, which I don't believe there are. But yes, there is exposure. But again, this is the contract that we have, so it is contract language.
The one thing that would be relevant to that point is that we're getting ready to renegotiate and review contract language, and so I guess I would encourage at least some internal discussion and thought to where if there's any way to tweak this or, you know, to give a little bit more teeth to it to encourage the absence of some frequent flyers going forward.
Okay.
Scott, how many agencies were on time?
We have, I'm gonna do the math backwards. We have
I'm not hearing anything.
total. We have, I think, 3 that are on a calendar year. We had 8 that were not submitted timely, so we had, what is that math backwards, 8? That's not the right math. Ish, on time.
So about 50%.
Yeah.
Is that normal, or what is our?
You know, actually, the last several years, yes.
That's been the norm.
I think since COVID, actually, the first year of COVID, really, we had quite a few.
Okay.
We had 7 or 8 that were late, and I think consistently since then, we've had usually at least 5.
But to your point, how do we stop that though? It seems like, yeah, it's been going on, but why or how, you know, it seems like there needs to be more consequences for it being late or something, so that it stops.
I kind of think like what she was saying, you put some triggers in there in the contract language, you put triggers in there.
You know, we used to have a fee our agencies would have to pay, but we didn't like it, quite honestly, because we don't like to make them pay us. But why?
We just have to be more strategic about it. That's all.
So, I mean, it's definitely something we can consider.
Yeah, I mean, not necessarily making them, having a financial, big impact with, taking something from them and making them pay a fee or whatever, but something that will impact it, something that will impact, we will be able to discuss that later.
Yeah, I think withholding funds is really the best way to do it. Just to kind of address the overall feeling of like, we're like, wait a minute, why are people being late? Why aren't they respecting their contracts? And we contractually have the power to withhold funds.
Right.
And when you're looking at your cash flow, as an agency that we're supporting, if I'm a executive director, I'm looking at cash flow all the time. And if I'm looking at not getting a March payment, and I don't have my audit done, and I'm getting my notice in January, it is behoove me to make sure that in the next 60 days, I get my audit submitted. So I think that the holding them accountable is in place, and I think it's a reasonable holding them accountable. Because I have to agree with Jenny, making someone pay something doesn't really solve anything. But
No,
withholding funds does.
Right. And you're just punishing our clients if you take any money.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
I think that's the point.
Yeah.
right.
Same thing with withholding funds as a punishment for not
Right.
fulfilling your contract.
Yeah. So I think the right mechanisms are in place, and I think they're fair. I think it's up to us if we want to change that or whatever, but at this given point, we don't have that as an option. So for today, we have to focus on approving the motion to withhold these funds if they're not submitted in a timely basis.
So move. All right, so just to clarify, we are, the motion is minus Center of Hope Family Services. So I'm sure you guys are all agree with that. Okay. All right, so,
Was there a second?
Yeah, there was a first and a second.
yes. Okay, so all those in favor? Those against?
Just a question, again, we had discussion. So are we voting on the original motion that's written here? With no
Yes.
amendments, with no changes?
No, she read the motion into the record that excluded family or center
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 of
of
Hope.
Hope Family Services.
And the motion would be to approve the late submissions.
To approve the
To approve withholding of funds.
Withholding the funds, got it, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, that's what I wanted to hear.
That's good. Good.
So let's see, all those in favor?
Aye.
Okay, those against? Those abstaining? Okay, motion passes. Thanks, Scott.
Okay, thank you, everybody. We are going to break new technology grounds in our next effort.
Really?
You have in front of you a 360-degree webcam with microphone called the OWL. We have Mr. Frank Hickman scheduled to do a presentation for us on the fiscal year '24 draft provider agreement changes. As you recall, several months ago, you allocated $12,000 for me to engage Mr. Hickman in a discussion and to facilitate changes to our contract. It was substantial energies and efforts going into this document. As you're aware, 45 pages long. It has been realigned and several changes have been made to it or suggested. I guess let me just say that, suggested. Just so you know where we're at, I sent this to you early last week so you could get a head start on looking at it. The day before I sent it to you, I also sent it to the providers. So the providers are also doing the same thing that you're doing, in that you're reviewing it. I'm sure their legal's reviewing it. Our legal consultant is on the screen, larger than life. Hi, Frank. And you're still on mute. Hello. And if you are able to share the document on your side, are you prepared for that?
I am prepared.
All right, I'm going to turn it over to you, Frank. Thank you.
So you should be able to see a split screen.
And we are.
I'm deeply relieved to hear that. Okay, I'm going to walk through the changes. I'm not sure how much detail you want, and as I was going through preparing for this, I realized there were some errors in references, which I will send a corrected version of. The substance isn't changed, but there were a lot of moving parts and I screwed up some of them. In general, the effort was to have a document that is right in the sense that duplicate requirements were eliminated, sections that were not supposed to be, that should have been combined and were in separate parts are now combined. There are massive formatting changes so that this document is now able to be treated as a contemporary document that can be changed with cross-references, etc. There were some general changes in language. Somebody or some section says that the provider must do something, and that's replaced by shall, and will is replaced by shall when it denotes an obligation. So those changes went throughout the whole document. The blue document is the original version that I was working with, and the white is the version that you are reviewing for approval. This is not a huge change, but in the definition of applicable law, I added as may be amended to cover changes that happen after the document is put into place. That's nothing exciting. applicable requirements, that is a major reworking of the sections, because there were elements that were sprinkled throughout the document that defined things that the provider had to follow in the way of statutes or OMAS protocols, etc. So I put them all in applicable requirements, and rather than referring to them specifically, it goes back to the definition of applicable requirements. So that's not a change in substance, but it's a change of fair significance in organization. So let's see. 1.6 in the original document had these terms that were defined in a single section, and I split those into two. That didn't change any substance, but it seemed like those were different points that needed to be separated. Now, eligible person is in the original a reference to attachment 1, and is relatively difficult for me to have a clear understanding, because in various parts of attachment 1 and other parts of the contract, there were sections that pertain to the eligibility of the individual. So eligible person is now defined as these elements, and I think that's accurate and complete. So part of this is a proviso that if there's an emergency service, a person can get the emergency service on a temporary basis, which is later distinguished from a crisis service. So that, in a sense, is a change. It's not change in practice, but it's a change in how it's phrased, and I think this is more clear. I don't know how you want to handle this, Scott, but I welcome any questions as we're going along, rather than having people try to remember.
Questions as we're going along would be fine, Frank.
Okay. So I can't see anybody, so somebody needs to just be assertive and ask the question. Okay. 1.8. So 1.19 and 1.20, I changed the phrasing slightly to be grammatically more appropriate. Now, Article 3 of the original version has been consolidated with Article 2. So Article 2 covers programs and services, and it consolidates the program and service requirements that an agency is required to provide. Article 3 was doing the same thing, and I'm not sure why it was in a separate article, but it's now, I think, in a single consolidated section without major changes in substance. Let's see, it's 4.1. Jumping to this section here, independent contractors, showed up in a couple of places in the original document, and I combined them and put them all in this administration section for the provider. It's not a change in substance, but it seemed to me that having these separated was confusing, and this makes it clear that it's all part of the same package, that an independent contractor status is the defining mechanism which is required. Well, I don't need to repeat why it's required. Okay, so this is an area that 5.3. B and C, these sections are under review by the staff, if I understand correctly. So this is the original language. It was a different number, but it's not essentially, it's exactly the same language. And that, I think, is still being reviewed for substance. Am I right, Scott?
Yeah, I believe our decision was to return back to the old language in the current contract.
Okay, well, that's what is in there.
Right.
So that's not going to be reviewed any further?
Right. No, what we were reviewing at the time was verifying that a Medicaid application does indeed, is allowed to be retroactive 90 days from point of application, and we were able to confirm that.
Okay. All right. Okay. Yeah, that's in this section here. Okay. So let's see. Article 5 is again reorganized to put things in a coherent order. I don't think, there was no change in the Medicaid criteria. Am I correct on that?
Correct.
Okay.
Other than the application timeframe from 120 days to 90 days.
Okay. Well, I should note that in the change thing as significant. I think that fits in the category. Okay, 5.3.1, this is something of a this part right here clarifies a policy, as I understand it, that the board has been following but hasn't defined it clearly. The agency has to make a reasonable effort, and the reasonable effort includes documentation and appeal. So that's something that I think is significant. 5 point.
Frank, what you're saying is basically that defines what reasonable expectations is, where before there was no definition of that.
Correct. Correct.
Is there some concerns? Because I'm seeing some of my board trustees with some questionable looks.
So emergency services is different from crisis intervention services. And this is a clarification which is, I think, significant. Emergency services are available to non-residents for a maximum of 72 hours. I don't think that's a change in practice, but I don't think it was all that clear. While crisis intervention is done through the ZEP center when available. So the distinction between who's eligible for when a non-resident is eligible for emergency services is, I think, more clear at this point.
Quick question. So my understanding of emergency and crisis is different from what's there. And typically, someone in crisis would not meet the medical necessity. That would be an emergency if they did. Right?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last part of your question.
So typically, someone who's in crisis wouldn't meet like the insurance definition of medical necessity. That's more of a that would be an emergency if they did. Right?
I'd have to check for that because I don't have that experience to tell you yes or no.
So I'm going to tell you my understanding so that way you can look into it, and if you have a different understanding or come to a different understanding, let me know. But an emergency is an imminent threat to life, health, or property, and a crisis is a situation that requires an immediate response, but does not constitute an imminent threat to life, health, and property.
I'm not sure I'm going to agree with your definition.
Okay.
I think what we would do is we would reflect on Ohio MAS definitions in this case and go back to the provider manual that they have to reflect on those differentiations.
So where is that defined at as it relates to this document?
Where is the provider agreement defined at?
What we're talking about is the question about crisis versus defining crisis versus emergency. If this document, is this document a reference that so we can have the understanding of that differentiation versus emergency versus crisis? Because I agree with Charles that there is. I have a different understanding of when I read it. If I look at it on face, emergency versus crisis being two different things.
First of all, we agree it's two different things. I'm just saying I might not agree that it was a definition that Charles presented. This document does reference Ohio Medicaid rules, which is where crisis intervention services would be defined.
Okay.
I'd have to go back in and find where emergency services is, but I'm pretty sure it's in 51.
I'm fine with the moment just referencing what we're using is okay.
So we'll dig into that a little bit more. And that's folks, that's the reason we're doing first draft look, so that we can have these conversations.
Absolutely.
Especially if this document, that's important, that becomes important, especially if this document has an integration clause where we're saying that all of the terms are set forth in the four corners of this document. If we're referring to somebody else's manual or standards, that we lay that out within the four corners. I'm not certain that it has an integration clause, but I would presume that it does someplace.
Well, that's a very interesting point, and it's a debate I've been having with folks for a very long time. The definition of applicable requirements includes statutes, rules, policies of OMAS, standards of the profession, attachments, the contract. So there's a host of sources that are relevant and binding that are not explicitly included in this document. I think if you put all of the words that are relevant and binding into a single document, it would quadruple the size of the document. And so that's the dilemma that you have when you're trying to understand exactly what's at play.
Well, I guess the concern that I have is that we want to be certain that we as a board and our agencies are on the same page as to when and under what requirement or what conditions they are required to provide services, whether, whatever it is, emergency, crisis, so that we're all operating from the same definition.
I think this document gives you the guideposts to look where you're supposed to look. But if you're saying, and it makes total sense, that there ought to be a document that has all the requirements in the four corners of the documents, this document doesn't do that. It puts you in it tells you where to look, but it doesn't replicate the sources that you're sent to.
Can we say that this document is more an interpretive document rather than the actual?
Well, no, I wouldn't say it's just interpretive, but it says when you're looking at services, you've got to follow the ethics laws, for example. You've got to follow the rules that are there. It doesn't stipulate every single rule that's applicable, but it does say you have to look at the rules, and you have to look at board policies, and you have to look at the protocols that OMAS has promulgated.
And there are different standards and laws for different mental health professions. So being a psychologist, there are things that I am not required to report that a counselor is required to report, which is strange if I'm co-leading a group with somebody. So it could get really complicated and large if we had every single thing.
So I guess as a matter of practice, we as a board don't have difficulty determining when we should be paying for something and when it falls outside the contract. Those kinds of situations don't arise.
Right, and the intent of this section in particular is if somebody is in an emergency service or in an emergency situation and they show up at a door that isn't our emergency service provider, ZEP center, that they are able to get some level of intervention while they connect back to our emergency services provider, ZEP center. So we don't want somebody just lingering out there, right, without any support whatsoever. Right. So this gives the agencies the cover. It's not meant to replace our emergency services provider. It's simply meant to let our contract agencies know that they can do this. And we are willing to cover those expenses. And you notice then that doesn't extend to residential, crisis residential, because that would be our crisis providers or our emergency services providers outside. This language, I don't believe has changed much, other than, I think crisis intervention may have already been in there, but I think it's simply separated out. Frank, can you find the corresponding change in the existing contract?
Okay.
I think what may be tripping people up is that I think the labels are inverted. And we can talk about this offline and process this a little more, but I think you might want 5.1.4 labeled as crisis intervention and emergency services swap, but that's something we'll have to discuss offline here. We're not going to solve that here.
I think the point that came out of the discussions that I thought was relevant, well, key, is that who's eligible for services? It was a question that came up, and is a non-resident eligible for services? Well, the answer, as I understand it, for emergencies, it's not necessary that you be a resident, but you only get 72 hours and you get, your return to the state of residence. Whereas crisis intervention, which is a Medicaid service, is something which is broader, requires medical necessity, and has to be done through ZEP Center. So I think there's a change in substance over what was in the original document, which came out of the discussions as I understand it.
Frank, I'm going to ask that we stick a pin in this and we have another discussion offline on this topic.
Okay, that's fine.
And my other question would be, when I write policies, I stay away from personal identity or identifying a specific agency. We have ZEP Center as the designee. Now, obviously, they are the designee. They are the agency providing the service. What happens if something, that we have to go back and monitor this each time? Or is this, what is the rationale for specifically identifying ZEP Center as opposed to an entity that provides that service?
They are the only entity that we fund to provide crisis stabilization services, residential crisis stabilization services. This language has been in our contract and was switched from our previous provider last year.
Okay.
I would typically agree with Mr. Brown, though, that it makes more sense to identify in a generic way so that the contract doesn't have to be changed every time. That's just my thought.
That's what I'm getting at.
At the risk of disagreeing with my board of trustees in a public meeting, I'm going to push back a little bit because I think clarity in this situation for our community and for our providers is paramount. And changing a word in a 45-page document is not that big of a deal for us. Should we ever in the future, hopefully not, have to change our crisis emergency services provider, which we've only done once in the last 52 years.
I see your point. I see your point what you're saying, but that was just my thought about, again, writing policy because of the change does come. You have to go back and do that and make the change.
Now, I will say that the board policy does tie back to this, and we do name ZEP Center as our emergency service provider. So this is all connected to the board policies.
Okay.
And I guess this is really for curiosity, and I know that this is not what we're trying to do here, but we're requiring, or the contractual language says that the agency shall arrange to return such persons to their county or state of residence. We can force in our contracts somebody who is in this county who is not a resident of the county to leave the state.
We're not forcing anybody to do that. That doesn't say force.
But it says shall arrange.
So if somebody decides they're driving, this happens a lot. Somebody's driving from here, from the way to Detroit, they're going to Indiana, and they get in a crisis here. They end up we're providing some level of service, trying to stabilize, and then arranging for their return. That doesn't mean we pay for it. That doesn't mean that we don't pay for it. Sometimes we may. What it does mean is that you're just not gonna serve the client, leave them and say, good luck.
Okay, so,
That's how I understood it, that's why we do that, is,
yeah, but my concern is it uses the word shall arrange. Suppose I don't want to leave.
You don't have to leave.
Well-
It's the-
So how could the agency comply with that if I say I don't want to leave and we're requiring that they shall arrange it?
We'll work on the language. But just
That's
for the
my
record,
question.
somebody sitting in this room or sitting anywhere else in Lucas County, homeless or otherwise, and they say, I want to be a resident of Lucas County, I want to stay here, boom, they're a resident of Lucas County.
Okay.
As far as we're concerned, and they're covered on all of our services.
Okay, so I would like to see that softened a little or something.
yeah. Maybe something like along the lines of client's request.
Or, yeah, if they,
We'll work on it.
thank you.
This is such a great opportunity for us to really take a look at this, so thank you, Scott and Frank, for being patient as we go through this as a team and comb through these different words and wording.
Frank, you want to move on?
Okay. Let's see, 5.5. So we're in the new contract here. 5.5. So this is a change in when the statement of revenues and expenditures for grant awards have to be submitted to the board. I don't think it was defined in the earlier version. On 3. Yeah, see, in the original version, it didn't have a date. So July 30th is now the date. So, I mean, that's not earth-shaking, but it is significant. On the audit sections, this ineligible findings shall include, it gives a list of findings which are determined by the board to be ineligible, and for protection, I added without limitation. So that if there's something else that didn't fit exactly what's listed here, the agency can still be determined to have an ineligible finding.
I like that. There was a quick question that Don you brought up, and I just wanted to let some of the newer members of our board know, we don't do this every year. He's like, do we do this every year? Like, no. This is just an opportunity arose for us to really take a look at our contract, update it, visit it, and make some of the changes that we feel are important to be good guardians of the funds that we are stewards of.
Next section, Frank?
Okay, there's a number of sections that reference when boards or agencies have to provide notice and when there may be a basis for withholding money or deferring payment. And the reference here is to 7.4. And here is the definition of substantial change. So you have in one place all of the points that we consider to be evidence of substantial change. So that is referenced here with renewal under the 120-day requirement, or if there is a substantial change, you have to give notice in the interim. If there are substantial changes in other sections, it can be the basis for changing the funding. So this is a list that I believe is comprehensive. Now, you're going to ask me what is a material change, and that is a term which means something other than a meaningless change or insubstantial change, and it's a little bit circular, but I don't know how to make it any more clear. And this was done in part to respond to some of the issues that have come up in the last couple of years. So substantial change is defined more clearly, and the two most important changes are this one, a 20% reduction or increase in staffing levels, and then program elimination or expansion. So those are consolidated references to what a substantial change means, and it adds or expansion or increase in two of the sections.
The only question I have about this is, the only thing that doesn't make intuitive sense to me, so I'm hoping you can explain, is why an increase of staff would be something that would constitute a material change. Like, because what if it's staff for, I don't even know. But why this is to notify us of this?
This is to notify us that it's your intent to substantially change our contract.
So in what circumstances would an increase of their staffing levels affect us? Whereas I could see with the decrease, they may not be able to provide the services that we contract.
They could spend your money faster, which means you funded a whole year and now you're only funding 7 or 8 months worth of service.
Thank you, that explains it.
And that apparently has happened, which is why this language was added.
Next section, Frank.
There was a correction about a prior language that said all emergency, only admissions to state hospitals had to be reviewed for emergency admissions by the designated agency, and it's all emergency admissions, so that was incorrect in the original, and it's now correct. And the section in 11.9 of the old contract that said the agency is operating as an independent contractor is moved up to the beginning. So those are the highlights. There were some minor language changes, but that was just me being nitpicky. That's it.
All right, you want to stop your share, Frank? All right, we appreciate you're going through this for us. I know it's rather difficult to kind of do this electronically with the intricacies of a contract language. We will take your feedback and any additional feedback that you'd like to provide to us. And begin the conversation about integrating the changes that make sense. We'll be doing the same thing with the providers that are flagging their changes and their considerations. And eventually what we'll do is we will merge the conversations, create language as appropriate within the document, and then bring the document back to you for final or last review, which won't be as detailed as this, on February 7th. Final approval is on February 21st. And then all of those changes are condensed into a 120-day notice process for every agency that will be providing a contract to. Because the realignment, revisions, all of that are fall under the substantial change requirements. So from there, just kind of playing it all out, providers who do not agree with the changes that are in the final version of your contract can appeal those changes that appear in the 120-day notice letter. We have conversations, board level. If we can't come to a resolution, they can actually ask for a board-to-board meeting with you, and that happens in one of the appeal hearings throughout that we have scheduled throughout the next 3 months. All of this has to be done, and all final decisions have to be done on our end by the April board meeting. So we finalize everything on the April board meeting, and then if providers are still unhappy with the changes that were identified in the 120-day notice, they can request non-binding mediation with the Ohio Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services. And then that can take up to 60 days. Frank, I think I described that correctly, correct?
Yeah.
All right. It's rare that we get to the Ohio MAS side of things, but it's not rare that agencies have issues with our suggested changes and want to meet with the board to discuss it. So every year we have a series of appeals. We're open to those appeals. We encourage those appeals because somewhere in those conversations we all make better decisions. So with that, Frank, you have any last comments? Why am I looking here? Frank, you have any last parting words?
No last parting words. Happy New Year.
Thank you, sir. We'll be in contact about changes.
Okay,
Thank you,
great.
Frank.
All right, we're going to shut this down now. Joe, playing the Wizard of Oz behind door number 1. Could you turn that off for me?
Pay no attention to the road behind the door.
Thanks, Joe.
So Scott, is it possible then for us to end up with different forms of our standard contract with one or two?
We would be in control of that. Let's say that. So
Okay.
if we want the possibility, then we control that. If we wanted to relent on one organization's request versus another and create a separate agreement, that would be something we would have to consider. Now, I can tell you that there is language in our emergency services providers agreement that is different than every other contract because of the nature of what they do.
Okay.
But we went to this agreement some time ago because we had, I believe, 3 separate agreements. So remember, if you were an agency that provided prevention, treatment, and support services, you got 3 of these. So we combined all them several years ago.
I'm so grateful.
Yes.
Which makes it hard to keep up with what's what without always going and pulling out a contract, a specific.
Exactly, but I believe that just kind of looking, while there are some issues with the draft, and we knew there would be, that's why we wanted to have this revision and the clarifications that you guys provided and the catches are substantive, and we probably would have missed them just because we get so deep into it, right? That we kind of look through it then. Or you make a decision and then you make another decision and then incrementally it doesn't say what you want it to say. So it's very helpful. We don't do this full process every year. We do provide you the contract every year, and we do ask you to read it and maybe just suggest changes, but it's, we don't bring legal in every year to kind of walk through this.
On average, how frequently is it done?
This is the first time we've actually brought legal in the 12 years. Now, legal reviews it every year, but you guys don't see that. It's usually done in the background, and then we just make recommendations to you all on this. This is the first time. Because of the changes, we wanted 2 reasons. One, we wanted you to see it, but also now this is on live stream and has been recorded, so now our providers who wanted to know or were concerned about something or have issues have some other resource that they can reference as well.
And thank you everybody for taking the time to read through this. I know it was very boring reading through this. At some point in time, like, oh, okay, but I really, the appreciation's there for the time and effort that went into reading this, because we want to put forth the best that we can and that ultimately serves our clients.
And again, we use this almost every day, so it's important to get it accurate.
Let me ask one more question so I don't have to wear myself into the middle of the night trying to think of what it is. We have diversity, equity, and inclusion, and recently we added that belonging, which I don't see here anywhere. Is there a reason? Or
Yes,
did I miss it?
No, there is no reason other than we just forgot to put it in there.
Oh.
So we will make that change.
Oh, good. I've heard my key for the day.
I got a feeling I'll be getting a few more notes from you before the day's over.
But this is why we love you. And this is why you're such a vital part of our
Joyce reading this.
Who said lawyers aren't worth the pay?
I don't know.
I mean, come on, this is, and we're getting it for free.
I know.
All right. I think we are at number 9. Amy.
Health officers. I'm on page 10 in the packet if you're following along. The advisory group met to renew new and renewal applications. This month we have 3 new designations who are being recommended, 2 from the ZEP Center and 1 with Unison, and then we have 2 renewals who are both with Unison Health. There's a motion in the middle of page 10, and I can answer any questions.
Is there a motion to approve?
So moved.
Second.
Any questions?
This is a generic question about health officer designation. Do we, statutorily, are we only able to approve health officers with agencies that have a contract with us, or if a private practice person came and made a request and met all the requirements and all that stuff?
I know the answer, I think you do too, but so go ahead and answer.
Well, it wouldn't be based on an individual person, but based on our own policy, an outside agency can request to have health officers designated. And we do actually have a few entities, but there are rules around it.
Sure, okay. Just curious, thank you.
So all those in favor?
Aye.
Those against? Those abstaining? All right, motion passes. All right, and Scott?
Okay, draw your attention to the bottom of page 10 and the remainder of page 11. Just want to give you an update on the Latinx RFP for behavioral health navigators and community and school-based prevention services. You know that we released the RFP after we completed a needs assessment. We had a deadline of response of December 9th. We had 2 organizations respond to that RFP. One organization did not meet the minimum eligibility criteria for receiving funding through that RFP, and although it was scored, was not considered. The second organization was scored. It substantively, technically met a number of criteria related to providing services, but it fell way short of the board's vision for the provision of cultural and the integration of the Latinx, and integration into the Latinx community. Therefore, the scoring committee did not make a recommendation for funding either of those proposals. I'm going to stop there, and since Ms. Christina Rodriguez was the chair of our committee, and Dr. Russell and Ms. Mendoza-Locke were also members of them, if you have any comments related to
I think we felt like our overall, like the bigger vision that we're looking at, especially after what we experienced over the last year in the Latinx community, that vision was not attainable with these 2 organizations. So we feel like it did bring some things to the surface that need to be revisited. It's almost like we need to start from the ground up, instead of, we need to build something new instead of trying to work with what we already have. And so personally, I feel like we have the ability to do that, and the desire with the group of people that were, there, the community members and the trustees that were there to give it another go around. But it was very honest conversations about both of those organizations. And I feel like we're headed in the right direction, even though it feels a little bit like we went backwards.
I would say both proposals had strengths and weaknesses. And did float the idea of like partial funding, and it just wasn't, we didn't see a way to do that with either proposal. So, I mean, we thought outside the box. It wasn't just like, is this going to work or not? It was looking at the whole thing and trying to find alternatives, and we were unable to do that.
Andrea, any other comments?
I think that the committee worked hard. In scoring, it was a lot of work. And I think that obviously the board helped us because obviously one of the agencies was not qualified, so that helped us along, but we did look at both. And I think, again, we made the best choice, and we need to go back to ground zero. And although we don't want to, because the time frame, but we know to have a good program, that's what we have to do.
So everybody we've had this conversation with, and I'm sure you guys are thinking it too, what's next, right? Okay, so we're sitting on almost a year, 11 months since services ceased, and there can be some debate on if that is actually accurate or not in relation to maybe it ceased beforehand. But I think it's clear that we should not do another RFP. I think we need to reinvest in our community efforts and help the community build what our vision is, which is really their vision, all right? It's not our, I mean, we co-opted their vision.
Right.
And so the suggested plan of action is for us, under my authority, to form a small work group where we will take the work that's already been done, engage community leaders in a more honest conversation about who and what can they contribute and how can this occur rapidly. Meeting with those, the idea I have in my head is meeting with them individually, then coalescing that conversation into a set of recommendations to include both Navigator, community, and school-based services. From there, then, if it's one agency or two agencies or three agencies, whatever that looks like, wrapping that support around that organization to uplift them and provide them the resources they may need to achieve the vision. So that kind of conversation doesn't happen tomorrow, right? I mean, those decisions will need to take some time. We'll have to piecemeal some of it together. There are certain things that just lend themselves to a little easier implementation than others. For instance, you can probably have navigators up and running in a shorter period of time with support, around the credentialing and licensing process, quicker than you might have school-based services because there's a few more hoops to jump. Plus, by the time we get to it, school's probably going to be over. So you don't start a school-based service in April, right? When the school's going to end in August, in May. So the goal would be to have school-based services and whatever that looks like for the Latinx community ready for next school year, and Navigator services, and we still need to think about what community prevention looks like. Ideally, before the end of this fiscal year, at least Navigator services by the end of this fiscal year.
And I do think that what's really important is that we look at the support, because obviously the community needs a lot of support in understanding what prevention is. I think we all have an idea that we want to, that it's some kind of magical thing that, helps kids stop becoming having an issue, further issues with mental health. And people in prevention know that it has to be skills and based on evidence-based material. And that's really hard to get those people who don't work in prevention to understand that. And so there's a lot of things that we really need to work with the community to understand what we're looking for.
Well said. That's all I have for you on that.
Okay. All right. Next one, open session.
The organizational meeting of the County Commissioners took place this morning. Pete Durkin was re-elected as the chairperson. They did make history, and not of the good kind. It would appear they'll no longer have the Pledge of Allegiance and the National Anthem at their meetings. I've been attending county commission meetings since Jim Holsworth was president back in the 1980s.
Wow.
And a bit of history, Pete Yerkin has refused to face the flag during the Pledge of Allegiance and the National Anthem since October of 21. What they did this morning was they had a moment of silence for people who have served Lucas County. That's a word-for-word quote. And then they went through the agenda like a knife through hot butter. And as they were finishing the meeting, they were reminded by the clerk, you guys forgot to approve the minutes of the last meeting. So I don't know what's going to happen. I do know that last summer they did allocate money so that they could install the equipment so that their meetings could be live streamed. Nothing's happened. I've asked, and I'm told, well, there's some supply chain issues and the equipment hasn't arrived yet, and when it does arrive, they don't know what their time frame is. But my understanding is the money has been allocated there to live stream their meetings. So we'll see what happens there. And the only thing that really happened that affected this agency was they said that one of their big priorities this year is the renovations of 701 Adams Street. They didn't go into specifics, but they said that when the renovations are completed, the employees in this building will be very happy. Thank you.
Wow is right. That was a meeting. Thank you.
Anyone else have anything for open session?
Well, I want to thank all of you. I want to thank you. It's been a rough road. It has been really rough for our Latino community and everything. And I want to thank you all for getting us to this point and really looking at it and starting to look at what the needs are of the community. And, you know, I like the findings that Guardiola put out as well. That is something that our surveys over the past 20 years have said we haven't had capacity. So this was a matter of time that we were going to get to this spot. So I thank all of you, and I give you more energy to continue to fight this and help us build that capacity and help us get the funding that we need for our families and our students that are out there in the schools, because they really do need it. And yet it is going on a very long time without services. So it is a push, and I applaud all of you for putting in the extra time and putting in, taking off time to be on the committees and looking and reading and stuff. So thank you. Thank you. I know it's a lot.
May I ask a question? Is there anything that we as a board can do to hear voices sooner? So you're not waiting 20 years?
Are you asking me?
I am.
Oh. Actually, I am in the process right now of writing up a lot of our Latinx community reports and trying to put them all together. We haven't had a benchmark. We have never been able to see, have we been able to move this needle at all? And I think that's part of our problem. We don't have a leader, we don't have a lead organization, we don't have a strategic plan, we don't have a voice really. So it would be nice, and I know I've reached out to Scott and I reached out to everybody, but it would be really nice to, what you're doing now, to help assist us to do this. Assist us, work with the schools, work with all the other partners, go outside of your doors and reach out into the community. Yeah, intermix with the community, get to, know that I think part of it is we lost a lot of our older generation, we have a younger generation, we need to, reinstill a lot of things. So we have to rebuild this networking. I've been in the system for a long time, but if board members could go out and interact a little bit more with the Latinx community and start building some of that, I think then we would gain some more of the cultural capital that we're actually missing. That's why you don't see us writing really well or following all the rules. That's all the cultural capital that we don't have. We've acquired the social capital. We know the right people in the right places. We know how to get the funding. We know all that, but we're still not able to get that ball over. So if anybody can help us get that ball over the line, that's what would help.
Okay, thank you, Linda. Anybody else have anything for open session? Okay, if not, meeting's adjourned.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for your patience.